Good evening, everybody. I would like to welcome everyone to the kickoff program for our annual Clinton County Reads event. I am Chris Owens, the chairperson of the Clinton County Reads Committee and the director of the Blanchester Public Library. And the book we selected for this year's event is Race Against Time by Jerry Mitchell, in which Mitchell describes his work as an investigative journalist in Mississippi when his reporting helped reopen several well-known unsolved murder cases from the civil rights era. And if you've already read the book, and this isn't really a spoiler if you haven't, you may have noticed that Jerry Mitchell had a lot of interaction with attorneys during his reporting. So we are very pleased to kick off this year's event with two people well-versed in this subject matter in what we are calling a conversation about justice and journalism. First, we have longtime legal analyst Beth Karis, and Beth has spent more than 20 years providing insight, analysis, and reporting on legal stories across the country, including 19 years as an on-air correspondent at Court TV. And she has covered basically every high-profile case that has taken place during this time. Beth is a graduate of Mount Holyoke College and Fordham Law School and spent 8 years as an assistant district attorney in New York City before moving into media. Also, we have Mark Godsey, who is the co-founder and director of the Ohio Innocence Project, which is based at the University of Cincinnati College of Law. Mark also teaches classes at the UC College of Law and wrote a book entitled Blind Injustice in 2017. The latest figures that I found show that since Mark co-founded the Ohio Innocence Project in 2003, they have secured the release of 34 individuals on grounds of innocence who served a combined 665 years in prison for crimes they did not commit. Mark is a graduate of Northwestern University and the Moritz College of Law at The Ohio State University and spent time working for a law firm and as an assistant U.S. attorney before moving to academia. I assume they may talk a bit about how they met and know each other, but I do know Beth wrote an article about 5 years ago about Mark in the Ohio Innocence Project for a Time magazine publication. And then finally, I want to let everyone know before we begin, if you have any questions or comments, please type them into the chat feature and we will address them at the end of the presentation. And with that, I will turn things over to Mark and Beth.
Thank you.
Great. So why don't I tell you how I know Mark? Actually, because once I left Court TV, I started working with a production company that makes documentaries and podcasts. I was reaching out and networking with a lot of people, and I was asked to work with a friend of mine who's a former writer for Law and Order SVU. This is actually independent of the production company. He was looking at a case that happened in Alliance, Ohio, and he always believed that at least one of the two men charged and convicted probably didn't do a horrendous murder in March of 1999. So I met Mark when I was snooping around on that case because a friend of mine who runs the Idaho Innocence Project told me about Mark. So I called him and he was driving in his car and he picked up the phone and he's the most accessible executive director of an innocence project that I know. And we became friends. But when Time magazine was putting out a special issue to celebrate the 25th anniversary of the Innocence Network, it was an issue called Innocence. The editor-in-chief here in New York knew me and asked me to help him shape the magazine and suggest some names and stories. And he said, you could write whatever you want. And I said, I want to write about Mark Godsey. And that's how we really got to know each other.
And I'm only accessible to people like you, Beth. Only when Beth Karis has called me, just kidding.
So Mark and I bring perspective on justice and journalism and the intersection from different angles, although we do meet through investigative journalism. But I started as a journalist at Court TV, as Chris just mentioned. And I only went to Court TV out of the DA's office because of its mission in the very early years of Court TV. I started on the 3rd anniversary of the network. And its mission was to educate the public, to be like the C-SPAN of the judiciary. And back in those days, when it first started, it launched on July 1st, 1991, a man named Steve Brill ran it, lawyer by education, but never practiced, real entrepreneur. we couldn't have opinions, not just reporters. I never had an opinion on air, but even our commentators were not allowed to have opinions. They had to educate. And I watched over the 2 decades, I watched the viewing audience get more and more sophisticated about the system, understanding who the players are and how it worked. And, you know, just the verbiage, they understood the terminology. But boy, did it change over the years. Brill left and other managers came in, and boy, and not only were our commentators giving opinions, which I guess is okay, but our on-air people were. I never would, because I thought, who am I to criticize a lawyer? I'm not in their shoes in the courtroom, and I don't really know everything they know. So it always made me a little bit uncomfortable when lawyers would, or anchors would come down really hard on some of the lawyers. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that, Mark.
Well, I mean, I saw that transition early on where it was more just sort of neutral, BBC-esque, right? Where it's just sort of, as you said, C-SPAN showing what's going on. And then in the later years, once you got to, you know, I think just media in general, it's like the Scott Peterson trial, maybe OJ is what changed it. I think that the media and things like Court TV started really slanting public opinion and making it sensationalized in a way that resulted in unfair trials. I mean, now you look back on some of these cases, they seem like they became witch hunts, and you know, what was being said on TV was just being repeated over and over again, and it becomes fact even if it's not actually fact. People get convicted by the media. So I saw the transition, and I was very troubled with it by the end, or at least now looking back.
So,
and you know, I don't love Nancy Grace. We've already discussed that.
Nancy,
I think is the biggest
yeah.
Sort of villain in that sense.
Nancy started after I did, but not long after, maybe a year or so after, and she sort of morphed into the Nancy we know, who was, you know, great sound bites, and you never saw a defendant who wasn't, you know, guilty and convicted upon arrest. But she actually is a very different person in real life, off camera. She's a very, you know, kind person. But the guy who started Court TV, Steve Brill, did say publicly more than once that I'm aware of once, but I believe he said it more than once, that he apologized for introducing Nancy to the world of journalism because he realized that he had unleashed someone who he didn't have a lot of guardrails, and nobody was reining her in, because she really did have a huge following. And I think she still does. I mean, her show lasted for quite a while because she moved over to HLN, but they eventually, you know, took her off the air, and she still reinvented herself with a radio show, and she's on Oxygen. So, and she even has a show about wrongfully convicted people, which offended people in your world, Mark.
Yeah, as we said when that was announced, and there were like text threads about Nancy Grace is doing a show about wrongful convictions, it's like giving Hannibal Lecter a cooking show, you know, because she's sort of like the biggest offender of perverting justice that we've ever had in the media. So that was quite outrageous that they gave her that show.
But I do want to discuss something you just you brought up about, you know, the media almost like causing these sensational cases, and there's no question that what was happening outside the courtroom was sensational. Did it spill over inside? Did it affect the jurors? Well, I'm unaware of any case that has ever been overturned, any conviction that's ever been overturned because there was a camera in the courtroom. All right, I'm talking about cameras,
yeah,
not just any media case, just cameras in the courtroom. We know cases, the venue gets moved for a trial when there's a lot of publicity in a community, right? When it's super saturated. But I'm not aware of any case. So like
my problem is not with cameras in the courtroom. So if you're talking about the C-SPAN model of just having cameras there and just letting people watch what's going on, it's when it became the sensationalized Nancy Grace show that becomes problematic, which is it's the ethics of what's happening in the talk shows and all those sorts of things.
So it's more prime time. You're talking about prime time opinions and stuff. Yeah, okay, I get it. I used to beg them at Court TV during the Jodi Arias trial, which is the last trial I covered. They took me off the air. They took Court TV off the air in 2013. So that was the last trial I covered. But there was almost like a game show in a square downtown at night in not far from the courthouse in Phoenix, and it was the people would sit in like a mock jury and they'd have numbers or plaques they would hold up, yes or no, and they'd answer questions. And it was like, and I'd have to sit off and do a analysis or something off to the side. I begged not to do that. I said, please don't make me be a part of this. And they didn't make me be a part of it, but I was also out of work at the end of the trial. So there you have it. But I found that I felt I was contributing because during the day, I wasn't prime time, during the day, I was explaining what happened in the courtroom. And one of my former colleagues, Jack Ford, who left Court TV and went on to a couple other networks, used to teach, I think he taught trial advocacy. He was an adjunct at Yale Law School. And he told me he would say to his students, I defy any of you to watch me on air and see what side I was on.
Well,
right?
that's the way it should be.
That's the way it should be, right?
Yeah.
You just give both sides. You just like, this is the defense argument. This is a prosecution argument. We'll see. And I always hated that question. What does the jury think?
And just to make clear, I mean, just to show how dangerous this is, like, you know, Nancy Grace goes on TV, especially because I will now have been intimately familiar and personally involved in cases that she comments on, and she literally just makes stuff up. I mean, she hasn't even read it. And so I was on a show with her a couple years ago. It was Dr. Phil, and she hadn't read anything. And so I started grilling her, and she and I mean, they filmed for like 2 hours and they showed just segments of it. She and I just argued, and I got my one chance to just point out what a liar she was. And so I did. And so I would say like, okay, well then if you've read that affidavit, tell me about this. And of course she couldn't do it. And I'd cut her off and go, no, you haven't read it. And you're up here giving opinions. And of course, because she's an entity and because they want to have her back, when you actually see the show, it's all edited so that she just gets away with all this stuff. And my pointing out all her lies didn't make it in the cut that aired on TV. It's just infuriating.
So that's one part. So that's one part of this intersection of law and journalism. And what is the responsibility of journalists to get it right? You know, we don't have journalists don't have a code of ethics like lawyers, but I have seen a proposed code of ethics that was written by a law professor in Los Angeles. It's not in effect, but her proposed code of ethics. No, I take that back. What she wrote was adding to the code of ethics for lawyers that if you are going to be a commentator on television, you better have experience in the field in which you're commenting. Don't be a bankruptcy lawyer and go talk about a homicide case. You better have tried some homicide cases. The code of ethics for journalists I have seen, but that's not what this professor wrote. Anyway, I don't think that the model rules or any professional rules or responsibility tell lawyers not to go on TV and start spouting about a case.
Yeah, but it's somebody like Nancy Grace or the journalist, they need to worry about keeping their license, right? They can just say, I'm a journalist now. I'm a commentator now. So do the legal, you know, canons actually apply to them? I don't know. I guess it depends on a case-by-case basis.
So that brings me to another area before we get into investigative journalism, which is Jerry Mitchell, because there's a lot of ways in which journalists and law intersect. There's this explosion of cases, of shows on TV that deal with law, legal stories, true crime stories, but also podcasts. And I can't listen to a lot of the crime podcasts because the hosts have all great intentions, but they're not journalists and they're not lawyers. You need one or the other. You got to either know the law, so you're educating people and not making mistakes and saying defamatory things, or
right.
You got to be a journalist where you've got some level of editorial supervision.
Agreed. But I think some of the really successful ones, like the first season of Serial, I'm blanking on her name right now, but I mean, she's obviously
Sarah Koenig, but she's a real journalist.
She's a real journalist, right? Even there were some cringeworthy moments for me in there where I felt like she didn't fully understand some of what was going on legally, but that's still probably about as good as you can get.
Right. So I do have a problem with a lot of the podcasts and not so much the TV shows, although some of them can be rather slanted, but investigative journalism, which is what Jerry Mitchell is, a journalist, and has his organization in Michigan, and Mississippi, and his fabulous book, which I read years ago when it first came out. How do they help you, Mark?
Well, in ways, sort of like Jerry did in his book, because it's getting the public involved and helping the public understand. What the main thing for me though has just been, we founded the Innocence Project here in Ohio in 2003, and so we're coming up on our 20-year anniversary. For me, it's been seeing how investigative journalism has changed, because when I first started, even sort of smaller towns like Wilmington around Ohio would have these robust newspapers that had editorial boards and people who would write op-eds, and they had investigative reporters, and certainly the bigger cities, but it was a different era. And so back in like 04, 05, 06, 07, when we had a case that we'd investigated and we were convinced the person was innocent, and we were getting ready to go to court, well in advance of going to court and going public with it, I would ask for an off-the-record meeting with the editorial board of the local newspaper. And I would go and do a dog and pony show and like explain for an hour with a PowerPoint presentation why this guy's innocent, why they need to be on our side. And a lot of times they'd file and they sort of assign an investigative journalist to dig into what we're doing, and they're going to follow the case once we file. And if we were right, I mean, they would take our side, and I really wouldn't roll the dice like that unless I knew we were right. And that had powerful effect, because particularly in like a state like Ohio, where there's elected judges and elected prosecutors, if you have the local newspaper and the editorial board giving sort of political cover to the judge to do the right thing, and saying things like, it looks like this person's innocent, they deserve a new trial, it can really change sort of the atmospherics and the politics. So I would view our cases of going back to court and trying to free an innocent person as a lawsuit, like we're going to court, but it was more like a political campaign, and it was getting the local media involved. And what's happened over the past 10 to 12 years is that has just dried up, and investigative journalism has disappeared. Even in newspapers like Cincinnati and Cleveland, you don't see very much of it anymore. And you go and you talk to an editorial board of a town, and you say, look, we're going to file in your town. And they say, we don't do them anymore. We just run AP articles all the time. And so that's sort of sad, obviously. And it's just this disappearance of newspapers. In that time, it shifted, though, as you mentioned. So it shifted to podcasts and TV shows. But there's an upside and downside to that. The downside is that very few of them, you can pitch and try to get the attention that your case needs from some national podcast, that if you get lucky, it hits one that they do a podcast on it and it gets 10 million downloads, and it has that positive effect that you were hoping for. But much fewer cases end up getting any kind of coverage, because very few of them are going to get selected for Dateline NBC or some major 8-part podcast that you used to be able to get local coverage on. So it's just really, really sad how investigative journalism has shifted and sort of disappeared in some ways.
So I'll just explain to viewers that production companies that are looking to do some true crime shows, as well as the Datelines of 48 Hours in 2020, they will scout podcasts, they scout books, they scout articles to then adapt for television. And so it used to be that you'd do a story and you'd go and you do a little 3 to 5 minute sizzle reel and try to pitch it. But now everybody's there's so much content out there, they're just looking at the podcasts and the articles and the books. So also, when it comes to the podcasts, you're not, a lot of them aren't real investigative journalists, and they're not doing the deep dive, and they don't have the resources. They're just kind of telling the story in broad strokes, right?
Right, exactly.
Right. Now, are there any cases in particular that you can tell, any Ohio cases that you recall that where investigative journalists helped you either get the story out there or even more recently?
Yeah, I mean, I've even, I won't name names on this, but I mean, I've had cases where an investigative journalist, this is early on, back when they sort of existed locally, would be digging into the case, and we'd end up sharing information, and I could eventually see that our interests are aligned, that they're sort of convinced the way I'm convinced, and where I would say, can you make this call? Because I can't, it's not going to work if I call this person. So they would make the call and share the tape with me. So it's almost like we're, in some instances, working together. But I don't know the ethics of that from the journalist's perspective, but I think they were thinking they were going to get something from us, and it was helping their job as well. So it sort of becomes this symbiotic relationship. We just had an exoneration less than a month ago on February 25th up in Lorain County, Ohio. in a case that has been going on since the 90s. And it's one of those, I don't know if you remember back in the 1990s, there was this national sort of craze, this daycare hysteria, they call it, where people were alleging that in daycare centers that the owners and the workers there were molesting these 3 and 4-year-old kids. And there were these allegations all across the country. Now, 20, 30 years later, we realized that most of those were just made up, concocted cases. They were always against daycare centers where there were, deep pockets, like funded by Head Starts, that could go against the federal government. And one of our cases, people got caught up in that, where parents made up these allegations. They coached the kids to say these statements, and the parents made millions of dollars. And we were unsuccessful in winning that case. Any of these are difficult to win, but we worked on it in the early 2000s and could not get the exoneration. But since that time, we've just worked on keeping it in the media. And so every opportunity, we tried to get podcasts on it. We got Dateline NBC to do an episode. Anytime we could get a journalist to focus on it. And through time, the effect of the journalism sort of changed the attitude of the public, to where, at the time of trial, everyone's dead positive these people are guilty and they're awful child molesters, to the point where 20 or 30 years later, because of media, the public opinion has swayed to the point where in the last prosecutorial election, people are asking the candidates, what are you going to do about that travesty in the Head Start daycare case? And one of the candidates ran on, I'm going to reopen the case. And then when he actually ended up winning, we approached him and we started working together to reevaluate the case. And he ended up just 2 weeks ago exonerating both of them. He gave a public apology and said it was just a complete miscarriage of justice and it was a ill-conceived prosecution. And that I can directly attribute to just efforts of drawing public opinion, drawing attention to the case through sort of national media. It takes a long time to do that, but it eventually swayed public opinion.
That reminds me of a little anecdote I want to share. It's back to cameras in the courtroom, but it's what the camera did in swaying public opinion. I covered a 3-week hearing in 2003 in Van Nuys, California, so Los Angeles County. And it was the murder case of Robert Blake, who was accused of Robert Blake, accused of killing his short-term wife of like 6 months or so. He had a couple, like a one-night stand with this woman, got her pregnant, and he did the right thing and he married her, but it was never a real relationship. Still, he didn't have to kill her. He was accused of trying to hire hitmen to kill her, make it look like kill her in his car behind a restaurant. He was going to take her out. I mean, he still had this whole plan. And the 2 stuntmen from his show Beretta testified that they refused him, but this is what he offered them. And she actually died that way. But he was accused of being the shooter. I happen to think he probably did find someone who did it, and that person got away, because I don't think he was the shooter. But anyway, he was a pariah. I mean, the public hated him when he got arrested. And his lawyer, Tom Mesereau, the man with the long white hair, great defense attorney in California, who defended Michael Jackson on child molestation charges. And, he had he's had some high profile cases. Anyway, he didn't oppose cameras for this preliminary hearing. So we televised it. There was no camera at the trial, but this hearing changed public opinion. And Tom has said to me later, generally I wouldn't really want a camera there, but I got to tell you, this one swayed because people saw the evidence. They saw the evidence. So it's all about educating the public, whether you're doing it over time through articles or whatever. That was a long process in the case you were talking about, the recent exoneration. But for Robert Blake, it was like in weeks, the public started to see, wow, this is like not what we thought it was. And then years later, when he's tried, that was 2003, 2005 was his verdict, March of 2005, he was acquitted. And the juror said we couldn't put the gun in his hand. I think he was probably there, but not the shooter. And that was the problem. They tried him as the shooter. Anyway, that's just an example of the intersection of journalism and justice. We at Court TV brought the trial into the living room and people understood the process. When I covered the Amadou Diallo trial in New York, in January 2000, that was 4 white New York City police officers charged with second-degree murder for killing an unarmed West African man.
Yeah, I was a prosecutor in New York at the time, so I remember that struck home to me. Yeah,
and they were acquitted. And there were no protests in the streets here. And Rudy Giuliani was mayor at the time, and he credited us. He mentioned Court TV and thanked us for being there, you know, with that camera, so people saw the evidence in the case. These were really remorseful cops. I mean, they were like balling their heads up constantly. But and I actually wrote down what Judge Teresi said in granting the camera weeks before trial, because it was a change of venue from the Bronx to Albany. And he got it like on the eve of trial. He's like, they're like, they threw this Megillah in his lap. And he said in granting cameras, he said, the quest for justice in any case must be accomplished under the eyes of the public. And that, of course, goes not just for a camera in the courtroom, but for you getting your stories out, your cases out there in the public. Jerry Mitchell uncovering, or basically resurrecting, these cold cases that were decades old, and getting people to pay attention to them. That brings me to cold cases. I mean, we're talking about as cold as they get, right? In the civil rights era cases. When I don't know your experiences, but I work with like state police. No, you were fed. You were fed. You were with Preet Bharara. He was under you, right? You trained Preet Bharara. Mark was down the street from me. I was the Manhattan DA's office, and he was the Southern District of New York. But at one point, my old boss, Robert Morgenthau, was the U.S. attorney in the Southern District. President Kennedy appointed him. He was 9 years in the Southern District, and then he ran for DA because Nixon almost forcibly removed him from office when he wouldn't step down. You remember that story? Yeah. So, but cold cases, I mean, cases get cold, they don't have something within, it's like weeks, a few months, no more leads. I mean, it's on to the next case. And unfortunately, these cases start gathering dust. And it takes sometimes an enterprising journalist to, dust off that case and take a look at it.
Yeah, absolutely. And in some ways that almost parallels innocence cases, because we're going back and opening up a case that somebody's been in prison for 20 years claiming innocence. And sometimes you get a little bit of attention to them, and all of a sudden witnesses started coming out of the woodwork. Right? You sort of bring up the case and there's a couple articles about it again. And then now time has passed and the emotions aren't as strong. And so I think maybe with cold cases too, doing what he's doing, some of the breakthroughs that happen years and years later are not going to happen at the time of the murder. Because if there's a conspiracy to frame somebody, or there's other things going on, it's raw. People aren't going to talk about it then. But it's years later, you can start getting people to talk when it seems distant.
But the flip side of that is, with the passage of time, memories aren't as good. So how do you, I guess look for contemporaneous notes or something that jars their memory.
Yeah, although I mean, for example, we exonerated somebody 40 years later. The conviction had been based on the testimony of one person who recanted. And so you say after 40 years, they come forward and they recant and they say, I lied at trial, I framed these guys. But in his recantation, he actually said, I was on a school bus. I didn't even see the murder. I was several blocks away. And we were able to get the yearbook from his high school class and track down people that were on the school bus with him. And we brought some credible witnesses to court, people who now have their master's degree and are real estate agents and psychologists and doctors and things, that said yeah, he was on the bus with us. We all knew he was lying. So, even 40 years later, something that makes such an impression, like a murder that one of their friends is involved with as a witness, or, if you're involved in a conspiracy to frame somebody and, you're part of the pact and you're not going to say anything at the time, you're still going to remember that 30 years later. Or if you overheard people talking about it at the time and you're scared to come forward, well, 30 years later, they might be dead. They might be locked up. And if an investigative report or an innocence project comes to you, it might be a different situation. So sometimes time has to pass before you can sort of break these cases. Right.
I mean, right. There was a book written recently, it's behind me somewhere, about Emmett Till, famous Michigan story, because the woman he supposedly had whistled at or whatever, which was the whole reason he was killed, had said, it didn't happen, although she was kind of vague in her memory. But yeah, anyway, everybody was dead in that case. The guys who killed him were dead. That, by the way, when they got acquitted, they then went on to Look or Life magazine or something and admitted that they did it. You remember that? Yeah.
Yeah, that's just absolutely unbelievable.
So, I mean, how are you working with journalists today? You say the investigative journalists, there just aren't as many at the local level. I mean, they exist. Jerry Mitchell has his organization. You know, we have the Center for Investigative Journalists. I mean, I forget the full title because we're always giving them awards at the New York Press Club, but they're doing things on a global scale too. But you know, the local investigative journalist is what's lacking, right?
Right. So there's one example where there's a local investigative journalist in Toledo that's taken an interest years ago in one of our cases. Two guys that are innocent, they're still in prison, Wayne Brady and Carl Willis. And he just made this sort of a personal campaign. He's actually at a news station. So he's at like a TV station there in Toledo. And he's done multiple shows. He's done now a podcast. He does editorials. He challenges the prosecutor. And so he's doing now in 2022 what we saw, you know, more commonly back in 2008. So it does still exist in little pockets, and you know, I give him a lot of credit for his work on that case. But really, the chances of getting coverage in just a broad swath of cases where we need it is much less likely now. So it's more the long-term game. Like, I want to try to get this on Dateline NBC. I want to try to get one of the major podcasts to do an 8-part series on it. And if you do, it's going to have long-term benefits, just like the exoneration I had from a couple of weeks ago, where it eventually changed public opinion to the point where the prosecutor said it's now the popular thing to exonerate these people, you know. So I would say it's somewhat less effective. It's in a different format, and it's fewer cases you can get attention to, and it takes longer. Podcasts take longer. Dateline NBC episodes take longer. We no longer bother even going to the local newspaper before we file and doing a dog and pony show with the editors, because they'll just say, we don't do that anymore. Like, you know, we just run AP articles. We really don't do editorials. We don't. And so to a large degree, it's sort of dried up.
Well, were you doing this? You're in Cincinnati. Were you doing this in Cincinnati or elsewhere in Ohio?
No, if we had a case in Mansfield, we would go to Mansfield and meet. There would be a local paper that would actually have investigative journalists and editorial board, or Wilmington, places like that, you know, where this is based. And we would go, and they would have people who would be interested and have the time to write about it and dig into our files. Another thing I've noticed is that as the newspapers have got thinner and thinner, and the staffing has gotten less and less, is that they're less interested in covering the stories with any kind of meat if they do cover them. So there was a local case in outside of Cincinnati that was on Dateline NBC. It got a lot of attention, where it was a young couple, newly married, and he was alleged to have drowned her in the bathtub. And the question was, did she have a medical condition and drowned accidentally when she was taking a bath, or did he drown her? And the prosecution was able to get a conviction eventually using just egregious junk science, just absolutely egregious junk science. And the media was covering the case, but they were interested in all the sort of clickbait stuff, like, was he you know, online looking at porn when she discovered him, and that's what got into a fight, you know. And I would say, like, this is a moment where we really need to focus on the problem with forensics in this country. And this is a high profile case where there's really egregious junk science forensics being used against this guy. Please cover this. I was begging them to cover it. I couldn't get anybody to cover it. And so they're really sort of just framing the issues about what will sell newspapers or what will get clicks, rather than what the public needs to be educated about, which is another change I've seen. It's more about clicks now.
You bring up forensic science. In 2008, there was a huge report that came out. It was like the National Academy of Science or something.
Yeah,
it was like a book. It was a hardcover book.
500 pages.
And you're calling for major changes in our lab. And we find out that, like, fingerprint evidence at the FBI have been erroneous. What, bite mark evidence?
And bite marks, total junk. Yeah, a lot of them are.
I mean, it's crazy and some places, Mississippi's one of them. The Cadaver King and the Country Doctor,
Country Dentist, yeah.
Country Dentist. That's the Mississippi Innocence Project, right? He wrote that. Tucker Carrington and
Radley Balco at the Washington Post.
He's the journalist, yeah.
Right.
And that's a crazy book about the death investigations, right? And the medical examiner. Oh my God. Anyway, I recommend that too. It's in Jerry's backyard. It's also, but I think Tucker's in Oxford, right? Jerry's in Jackson, Tucker's in Oxford. So here's a question I have about journalism and your work, not Jerry's, because Jerry's reopening murder cases. You're undoing an injustice. A lot of the true crime audience, and I don't think it's everybody, but a lot of the true crime audience, they're like very, pro-police and, maybe a little on the conservative side. And I mean, I'm kind of like very much pro-police. They don't want to know that there are mistakes in the system. They don't want to know that there are wrongful convictions. Sometimes it's hard to sell the wrongful conviction story to be told. There's got to be some major hook, like when 48 Hours followed Ryan Ferguson, the Missouri case. I don't know, because he was a good-looking guy, good-looking white guy. I don't know what it was, but that hooked the public. But people don't like to know that the system makes mistakes.
Well, I mean, I've heard that firsthand. So as I've been doing this work now 20 years, I've realized that it's not just about winning cases in court, that if we're going to have criminal justice reform, we've got to really educate the public and get the public energized behind this. And, and getting things on TV and getting this issue on TV is really important. I mean, you have all the lawyers who, you look at the gay rights movement and how much we've evolved in 20 or 30, 40 years, and the lawyers who are fighting for these rights in court. And then a show like, Ellen DeGeneres or, comes along, or Will and Grace, and they do more to change public opinion than 100 lawyers did filing briefs in these courtrooms. And so I realized that, I'm trying to do these things, but if we could get a TV show that really explains this to the public, it's going to go much further than anything I can do. And so the last several years I've spent working with filmmakers and pitching TV shows to different networks and production companies and stuff like that. And we will hear this, like, our audience wants the guy to go to prison at the end. They want to feel good about the bad guy got put away, and they don't want to have a victim who was actually raped and then find out that she identified the wrong person and the wrong person went to prison. That's not what our audience wants. And we just sort of heard that over and over again. So it's been very frustrating, dealing with the media. Literally going to Los Angeles or going to New York and pitching these production companies and pitching these networks. And I'm repeatedly hearing this. So they're just letting sort of what the audience wants dictates what they hear rather than reality, which we all know that that's how it works anyway.
Well, ideally, good journalism should just be good journalism, and you don't write and give the audience what they want, but they worry about ads and whatever. There was a question that came in. I think I'm allowed to ask it. Chris, can I ask a question? This question that came in, it's really from Mark.
Sure, no problem.
So this is from Eileen, and she says, what especially fascinated me with the work Jerry Mitchell did was how much actual physical showing up he did. He wasn't calling and emailing, he was like showing up, which is great to do if you can do it, right? If you're in the same state, right? Do you find that in-person discussions or interviews are more productive for an Innocence Project case, or does it not matter?
Oh yeah, it matters. It's everything. It's real easy to ignore a letter or a postcard or a voice message or a text message. So we have an investigator. We use different investigators around the state, but we spend quite a bit of money on sending investigators out to talk to people one-on-one because it's very easy. People are busy in their lives and they sort of don't want to get involved again, especially if it's a case that they testified in 30 years ago. And so if all they're doing is just hitting delete on their voicemail or delete on their email, that's going to be their go-to every time. But if somebody's at their door saying, look, we think a tragedy's occurred here and an injustice, can you give me 5 minutes? It's much harder to turn that person away. So absolutely. If all you did as an Innocence Project is sit there and email people or contact them on Facebook, try to friend them, and then send them instant messages in Facebook, you'd never get anybody out of prison. So you nailed it dead on. I mean, Jerry had to do that because that's how you get people to respond, particularly in an older case. If you're law enforcement, it's different. If you've got a badge or you're sending a letter or calling and you're saying this is so-and-so, people are sort of scared and so they'll talk to you. But if you're Jerry Mitchell or you're an Innocence Project, You've got to show up and catch them to get them to talk.
Right. How do you filter the cases? Because I assume some cases come to you and they're not actually innocent, right? They just say they are.
Oh yeah, most of them are probably not innocent. I mean, people write to us, so it's just word of mouth. And I think we've had over 10,000 inmates write to us since we started. Maybe it's 11 or 12,000 by now. And we've only gone to court saying somebody's innocent about under 50 times and we've won like 34 of them. That doesn't mean that the other, 9,950 are guilty, because I mean, I guess if this is a pie chart, the two biggest slices of the pie chart are people that you begin to investigate and it appears that they're guilty. That's probably the biggest part of the pie chart. The second biggest part of the pie chart, and these are both big chunks of the pie chart, are the evidence has been destroyed and the witnesses are dead and there's just nothing you can do. So it's just like, oh, this guy's been in prison 30 years and he's saying he's innocent. And, there was a flood at the Court of Appeals and they lost all the records and the evidence got thrown out because it got moldy and the witnesses are all dead. And it's like, literally there's nothing you can do. And so it's surprising how many of those just you find a dead end because of dead evidence. And then there are some where you go down the path and they're probably innocent, but the standard is so high. You have to really strongly prove that they're innocent, which is very hard to do. It's sort of proving a negative. And you end up losing, or you end up telling them, we think you're probably innocent, but there's not enough to go to court on. And this is going to eat up resources, tons of resources. And we're a nonprofit and we have to pick and choose. I mean, that's horrible. And then, the ones that we actually take to court, they've got to be so solid. That's a very small percentage that you're lucky enough to actually have the evidence still, and you can do DNA testing, or the witnesses are still alive and you can talk to them again. And they're willing to talk, and, the DNA evidence actually ends up having results after they've been sitting on a shelf for 30 years. You got to be pretty lucky to be one of those people that makes it through all those cuts.
So given all these hurdles and the limited monetary resources you have, limited funding, then that's all the more reason why you need investigative journalists to, help a little bit if they can. And you use students too for a lot of your research, right?
Yeah, I mean, we get a lot of free labor from law students. We have about 20 at a time and about 6 attorneys that are supervising them. So the students will do some of these interviewing and knocking on doors, like Eileen mentioned. But if there's any risk of danger or anything like that, or if it's going to take something that's a little bit more sensitive, like a rape victim, we're not going to usually go talk to under any circumstances, unless like she's sort of reaching out and wanting to talk to us, because we're just not going to traumatize somebody by showing up at their door 30 years later and saying, we want to talk to you about this case where you were raped 30 years ago. Even if we think the guy's probably innocent, we're not going to do that. But there's different levels of sensitivity that sometimes you want a professional for. But there are many of them that the students actually make contact and they do the interviews.
When you look back at your entire legal career, how many years were you a prosecutor?
6.
And Innocence Project 20?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Like when you reflect back on your 6 years as an AUSA, do you recognize yourself? Like, what do you think about those years?
Well, I mean, I realize now a lot of problems in the system that I was just totally blind to and in denial about at the time. I mean, I felt like I was working in a righteous system at the time. I mean, there were things that I didn't like about it. So for example, I thought the war on drugs was insane. And we were just going in and arresting all these people in a neighborhood and taking down all the drug dealers. And then new people would take their places 2 days later. And I didn't have the mile high perspective we have now about mass incarceration and on all the kind of stuff. I don't think a lot of people did as it was going on.
Right.
But the whole thing just sort of made me sick. I was somebody who, I would have cases about some CEO that ripped off millions of dollars from people and they would end up getting 5 months in prison. And then somebody who just arrived as an immigrant from another country and they act as a lookout on a drug deal just to feed their family and they get 20 years in prison. And it just, the drug cases just disgusted me. So I did everything I could to get off of them. But other than that, by and large, I felt that it was a just system and the evidence I was using was reliable. I used a lot of things that now I know are junk science, but I didn't know it at the time. Interestingly, I mean, this is about law and journalism. we had a relationship as prosecutors with journalists. And, you know, it was very, very common to talk off the record and leak things to journalists to sort of bait them and get them interested so that they'd cover your case. And you wanted them to cover your case because you wanted to taint the jury pool. You wanted the coverage to be favorable to you. So you wanted to sort of leak them and give them information. And I've got reporters now at local newspapers that will only cover things favorable to the prosecution, I think, because they depend on those leaks and they don't want to piss them off. So they won't cover an Innocence Project case, in my opinion, very fairly. That's not all newspapers, but some. But I mean, when I was there, I worked on an organized crime case where the lead prosecutor got kicked off at the last minute because he had been leaking things to a reporter. And it was sort of an exchange for when the reporter writes a book about the case afterwards, he's going to be, you know, sort of the star of the book. It was disgusting. So he sort of looked like he was doing it for his own sort of fame. And the reporter ended up recording him and turning him into our supervisor, and he got taken off the case. But so there's all sorts of different motivations. People in prosecutors' offices are very ambitious. It's a very political job. A lot of times they want to be in the paper all the time so they can run for judge or, you know, different things like that.
We were not allowed to talk to the media. I mean, now and then people would call me, but I was really careful about it. Although People magazine, because I worked with John Kennedy Jr., People magazine called me because they were putting him on the cover as the sexiest man. And they wanted a quote. And I don't know how they got my name. And I said, you can't use my name. But they said, give us something about John, because we were in a small unit, just 6 of us. This has nothing to do with law and journalism. But
was this George Magazine?
What?
Because I worked with him on George Magazine at the law firm I was at.
Oh, you did? You worked with him
Yeah.
at George? Okay. So I stayed in touch with John, you know, well, right up until he died. But we were in the same unit. There were 6 of us in this unit investigating racketeering, and Elliot Spitzer was our boss. So Elliot
Who later got
belongs
busted for the high price
yeah,
call
for the
girls.
prosecutor. He was governor of New York eventually, attorney general and governor. So what was I telling you about John? I forgot what I was telling you about John. Oh, no, what was I telling you about John?
I don't remember. Wouldn't you bring up John? We all have so many
Oh my
memories.
Oh my God. I wanted to tell you my John Kennedy story.
That you had that you were asked for a quote from People.
Oh yeah, I was asked for a quote for People Mag. Thank you, Chris. And so I said, and this was the truth, I said, when he looks at you, when you're talking to him, he looks you in the eye and he doesn't look away. He makes you feel like you are the most important person at that moment. He's not looking around over your shoulder, who else is there for me to talk to here? Because I was rarely with him alone. I was off, it was either the office or a function or something. But he like, it was very sexy. He just kind of looked you in the eye and made you feel important. So that made it into People magazine. Anonymous quote, but it was me. Anyway, sorry, I blanked for a second because I was thinking about his cases. I had talked to him like right after the rape.
I don't know, you were blushing a little bit, Beth. I think you were still sort of thinking back to your crush on him.
No, he did. I was swinging my hips on the edge of the dance floor once at a party, and these arms came around my waist, and I looked up and it was John, and he whispered in my ear, you know, we really should go out sometime. It never happened.
Dang.
Okay, so I digress. That was the Manhattan DA's office. I did not talk to the media though, really.
So we did. Our AUSAs, we talk to the media all the time. And we were often the ones that were quoted. Mary Jo White would be quoted, obviously, too. But then we also talk to them. We leak things all the time. We talk to them off the record. Yeah.
Our leak was Mr. Morgenthau. He controlled it. He would leak to the New York Times, whatever. But it was he knew what he was doing, right?
Mm-hmm.
But you are right, though, that as prosecutors, leaking controls the narrative.
Mm-hmm.
And it's more of an uphill battle for the defense. But you're an advocate for the wrongfully convicted, so you're representing defendants. You're representing defendants,
Mm-hmm.
and you're wearing a very different hat. Like, was it a hard transition for you? Because you told me an anecdote once, perhaps you can share, about when you first started, when you were I think in Kentucky or something.
I was a prosecutor, and my first job as a law professor was at a different school. I'm at the University of Cincinnati now, and they had an Innocence Project, and the professor who ran it was on sabbatical. So the dean said, you know, you've got this investigative background, so you're going to run the Innocence Project. And I was, I sort of was like, you know, I can't say no, but this is utter BS, right? There's no innocent people in prison, because I was looking at it as a prosecutor. And the very first meeting, the students were talking about this guy they visited in prison, and he was so emotional, and it was so awful how he'd been wrongfully convicted, and the students were tearing up. And I was sitting there in the meeting thinking to myself, like, what a bunch of gullible, stupid, students, these kids, they don't know what they're doing. And then DNA testing proved him innocent. So it came back and he didn't do it. And so it was a huge moment of like eating crow, and made me start to question why I had been so close-minded. And of course, because I'm working in the Innocence Project that year, I have to go to the national conference, and I ended up meeting these exonerees and from all over the country, and these lawyers to do this work, and hearing these speeches. And it was just like this, it's like taking the pill, like in the Matrix, like, it's like, oh my God, I've been like operating under this system of blindness and not understanding all these problems. And I've just been in denial about it. And there's all kinds of problems. And so I was a convert by the end of that year.
That's so interesting. For me, it's more of a progression, because I saw prosecutors overreaching in different parts of the country. I would cover cases in cities and in small towns, and I just saw overreaching. Like once I was in Dallas, and I was covering a capital murder trial. And it was, I don't know if you guys remember, but years ago, maybe 20 years ago, there were these 6 escapees, and they went on the run, and they were like killing a lot of people. It was like the six or seven escapees in Texas, and it was a trial of one of those escapees.
Didn't they shoot a cop right when they got out, like in Dallas? Still,
they shot a lot of people. I think one was a cop.
Yeah, I remember that.
This wasn't the first one to go to trial, but it was the only one I covered. I didn't remember his name, but at the time, Texas didn't have an alternative to death of life without parole. It was like a sentence of up to 99 years, but theoretically a parolable sentence, or death. And I said to the prosecutor, like, why don't you guys have LWOP? That's what they call it in California, life without parole, LWOP. Why do you have LWOP? He said, we're more likely to get death if we don't have the option of life without parole, because jurors want to know that the person will never be free. They're not so concerned with death versus life, as long as they'll never be free without parole. And I think you've probably seen that there's a trend away from the death penalty.
Sure, yeah, and that's very true what you just said, that if you have life without parole, most jurors will go for that instead of death.
Yeah. The reason I know I'm here is because I know Mary Thomas Watts, and I had covered a case, at least a penalty phase of a case in Wilmington, a horrible murder case where no body was recovered. And Vincent Doan did not get death. He's serving life, but there's that concept of, we talked about it off camera, of lingering or residual doubt in cases of no body. And that's what this was. And so jurors, you'd never saw an autopsy report because no body was recovered. So there's that residual doubt that is this person actually maybe alive, and they can rely on that in determining whether a person gets life or death. So he got life, but I hope he never gets out, frankly. Anyway.
Are you ready for some questions?
Mm-hmm.
You two ready for a few questions we have?
Yes.
Yep.
First of all, I thought this was an interesting one. How much did Brian Stevenson's book, Just Mercy, raise awareness of wrongful convictions? The book, and then became a movie.
I think it did. I think there's several things that have helped raise awareness. The biggest one, in my opinion, was Making a Murderer, the Netflix series. And I think that came first. And, when I do a lot of speaking, so I would go speak at places, and it would take them a while to understand even what I'm talking about, or be able to sort of understand that wrongful convictions occur. And after Making a Murderer came out, it's like people had a framework, because so many people saw that. But yeah, that and Just Mercy, the Brian Banks movie. We need more. We need a Ellen DeGeneres, with the TV show from the 90s. That helped change views on LGBTQ issues. I can't remember, but we need more. But those are things that are in the right direction that are starting to help.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Another question we had, Jerry Mitchell talks in the book a bit about the fact that he failed much more than he succeeded when it came to the cases he worked on. And I wonder if, Mark, you feel like that sometimes, and how you deal with that.
Oh yeah, in a variety of ways. So and unable to find the evidence, and you have to shut down a case before you really have a sense of whether they're innocent or guilty. But the system is really resistant to admitting that it made mistakes. And so when you work for 2 years and you build up a pretty strong case that the person was wrongfully convicted and they're innocent, you have to go back to the same courtroom and the same judge that convicted them. And, it's the same prosecutor's office. And I've had cases where the prosecutor who's assigned to evaluate our filings or the judge have framed newspapers of the day they helped convict the guy on their wall. It's been their trophy. Right. And so these are often high profile murder cases and stuff. And so it's very hard to have any sort of objective view. And so the system fights back really, really hard and engages in a lot of mental gymnastics to avoid admitting what in many cases just clear evidence. And so this job, you feel like you get beat up a lot. You feel like you get kicked in the teeth, like you feel like you're seeing the worst side of humanity. You feel like people are cheating. Because the evidence is clear and they don't want to do the right thing. They don't want to open themselves up to liability. They don't want to have the embarrassment. I don't know what it is. And so we have a lot of cases where we think that the evidence of innocence is really strong, and you have to call the person and say, we lost. You got to spend the rest of your life in prison. Now, sometimes we eventually win those cases on appeal, or like the one a couple of weeks ago, we got in the news so many times over the years that eventually public opinion changed and the prosecutor agreed to go back and revisit the case and let him out. But it's a very difficult job. I mean, we've got a group therapist because we're hit roadblocks so often, and it's a depressing job. I mean, people just see the wins when we're walking somebody out of prison and everybody's cheering and everything, but the day to day is much more grim.
Yeah. Another question we received was, how much cross-pollination is there between law schools and journalism schools? If either of you can address that. Or...
I didn't have any experience in law school with journalism, but I can't speak for other law schools. You've spoken, Mark, you said the NYU Journalism School.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
yeah, on topics related to this. But I would say there's some innocence projects that are based at journalism schools. So for a long time, there was an innocence project at Medill School of Journalism at Northwestern University. I don't think there are any more innocence project based at journalism schools, but I had the same experience with you, Beth. In general, I don't think there's a lot of overlap between the two.
But Yale, I think Yale Law School offers a 1-year master's it's law for journalists. I don't know what it's exactly called, but I know someone who went there. And so if you are a journalist, but you want to cover legal stories, that's a 1-year program. It's probably a good one too.
Sure,
just to learn the terminology and the procedure, because if you're a journalist and you're walking into a courtroom, and for me, it was second nature. I mean, I left the courtroom trying cases, so it was so easy for me to make that, transition to Court TV, and I could understand the objections and everything that was happening. I could explain it so easily, but I can't imagine somebody who didn't have my background showing up in court and just not knowing everybody's role and all that.
Yeah, I spend so much of my time explaining that procedural stuff to reporters who just don't get it. Often I have to go through it. Something as complicated as federal habeas, they don't get it.
Right.
And I have to, explain it again and again and again.
Right. That's why lawyers, when I was out in the field, lawyers they told me they'd enjoy talking to me because I got it. I talk to them on another level. Then they call me up and ask my advice. And I was like, I can't give you advice, who you should call for a witness or what evidence you should put in what order. I can't do that.
Another question I had was, you talked a little bit earlier about a code of ethics. In the epilogue of Jerry's book, he talks about the guiding principle that's guided him throughout his career has been truth rules. And I just wondered if you guys had any comment on that, and maybe if you've thought about what's guiding you in your careers along those lines.
So when I first left Court TV and I had some business cards printed up because I no longer could use my Court TV one, I had a tagline, it was like Beth Karis. The tagline was seeking the truth one case at a time. And I always sort of considered myself a truth seeker wherever the evidence led me. And I did that as a prosecutor too. I mean, I dismissed cases, and I have my own stories about cases of people that came to me. I didn't get the case originally as probably somebody wrongfully arrested, and I prevented a wrongful conviction by dismissing a case halfway through jury selection. But I've always been guided by truth. So Jerry's right, truth rules, wherever it takes you. And Mr. Morgenthau used to tell, or my bureau chief used to tell us, there's the ADA, and then Mr. Morgenthau, the DA, and then God. Like that's it. Between us and God, that was just Mr. Morgenthau. We had to make the decisions. We had to do the right thing, and the right thing didn't mean getting convictions all the time. It meant reducing the charge if that's what it took. It meant dismissing if that is what the right thing to do was. And I was always very, very proud to have worked under him, because, I saw abuse by prosecutors around the country, but I didn't feel that we did. Central Park 5 aside, I think that people did not really realize what was going on with Central Park 5. I don't think there was anything malicious by the prosecutor. I know the prosecutor in Central Park 5, and she's a great prosecutor. But Morgenthau did the right thing when the evidence came out. And not only, those 5 were completely exonerated, even though they were assaulting in the park other people. Those were proven cases. They were assaulting people. The rape they didn't do, and he let them go on everything.
The system, it's up to the individual, and it's up to leaders, because I think the leaders set the culture for their office. But the system itself is not set up for the truth. The adversarial system sort of conditions people to take a side, and it's us against them, for both defense attorneys and prosecutors. And journalism, the way it's changed is it's about getting clicks, sadly. And so if you're going to be somebody who's about truth, you've got to try to set your own boundaries and have your own rules, and sort of always be aware of how the culture and the flow is going in a different direction. You can be a prosecutor and be the elected prosecutor and set the culture for the whole office, and people will follow. But if there's not, and I've seen how a prosecutor can create the culture of honesty and truth, and like Beth was describing, but generally they don't. And so people end up just going with the flow. And the system's not about truth, like I just said. And what I try to do, we've had cases we will look at, and I can look at it and I can go, I can win this. I can get this conviction overturned, because there's an egregious Brady violation, but the guy admitted to us he did it. Or we don't have a good faith belief that he's innocent. And so we decline the case, and we'll submit, we'll refer him to somebody else who's not an innocence project. But like early on, when we first started, and I'm getting money from donors, and if we go for 10 years and don't get any exonerations, then the donors are going to dry up, and the whole thing is going to end. I felt pressure to solve cases, and I don't care now. I mean, as I've gotten more and more established, and we've had a lot of exonerations, I don't care one way. I just want, however case turns out, it turns out. But at the beginning, I sort of felt that pressure the way a prosecutor does, that you need to come out a certain way. And so you really had to fight it more. I mean, people are in systems, are human beings. And so you've got to set up those parameters and police yourself, or you're going to get sucked into it.
Have you heard I've heard defendants say, I thought the truth would come out if I went to trial. I thought they would understand I didn't do this.
Well, yeah, every single exoneree says, well, I wasn't even scared because I didn't do it. And how in the world, that's ludicrous that I'll be convicted if I didn't do it. And they described that they sat in trial, and it was obvious to them the witnesses were lying, and it was like a farcical, like watching a sitcom, but they're the only ones seeing it that way because they're the only ones who know the truth. And then all of a sudden the jury says guilty, and they're absolutely flabbergasted, like they're in the Twilight Zone.
Speaking of truth, I think we'll wrap up here. I don't know, did you see the other question in the chat? It had to do with about recent brain research into how the human brain reasons. And if you're aware of any law schools or journalism schools that are trying to address this new knowledge about.
So that's a good question.
Trying to manipulate public opinion.
I'm sorry, I had missed that before.
No, I'm not aware of it. I mean, I'm aware of just generally confirmation bias and some of that, but no, I'm not aware of this.
I did speak with a neuroscientist in Phoenix. Gosh, he's a friend of a defense attorney there, Mark, I forgot his last name, and he is looking into something like he is doing something in this field. You know, if you send me Chuck's email, I can, you know, dig out that
Okay.
information.
Yeah,
This
we can
guy
do
is, I think he was going to, he might be testifying in some cases. It is an area that's like, there's research being done.
Okay. We did get one question that just popped up there. How can prosecutors review wrongful convictions such as CIUs without external oversight?
So
CIUs are conviction integrity units. Go ahead, Beth.
yeah, I was going to ask you about that, Mark. Actually, that was something that crossed my mind before we got to the questions with Chris about conviction integrity bureaus or units, because a number of prosecutors have them now, and you know they're pretty well staffed to do the right thing.
Well, I mean, the ones that are done right are more effective than an innocence project. So that's the absolute best method for getting people out of prison if done right. The problem is that most of them are not done right. They're just set up as sort of like political eye candy. We're going to have a conviction integrity unit, and they just appoint prosecutors to it who are very much like I was when I first got into academia, where you think there's no wrongful convictions and they have confirmation bias and they decline everything that comes to them. That's unfortunately how most of them are. But the Quattrone Center, which is the think tank at Penn Law School, puts out these best practices and how to make it effective. And there's all these different best practices you're supposed to follow, where the CIU has total political independence and is staffed by somebody who doesn't have a prosecutor background. So they come at it more neutrally. And when it's done that way, it's extremely effective. So it's a night and day difference depending on how it's structured.
So Harris County's conviction integrity unit in Texas was pretty effective for a while there. Houston, right?
Yeah, and right now the ones in Detroit and in San Francisco and LA and Philadelphia, Brooklyn for a long time when Ken Thompson ran it was extremely effective. I mean, if it's doing it right, they're just pumping out exonerations and finding wrongfully convicted people left and right. Because just think about it. All the time I spend just trying to get the file, and the police will fight us on turning over the documents. It takes years. I mean, they just got it right there. So it makes everything so much easier if you have people with the right frame of mind that are doing it.
And are they open to hearing from the defense? They do, the defense attorneys, right? They do.
Well, yeah, I mean, they're open to, I mean, so theoretically we have some in Ohio that some of them are sure they hear from us, but they oppose every single thing we do. So, you just know before you even start that they're going to fight back. And this is not a unit that's following the best practices and has people who are looking at it objectively. So it's more designated people to fight the Innocence Project, that this is your job, rather than truly reviewing convictions with an open mind and trying to get to the truth.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, with that, I think we'll wrap things up. We're about out of time here, but I want to thank both of you for a fascinating program. And thanks to everyone for attending. I will remind you that you can get copies of the book Race Against Time at one of the sponsoring libraries in Clinton County here, the Wilmington Public Library, Blanchester, or Sabina Public Library, or order it online at booksandmore.org. And we have several other discussions and programs planned over the next month. And you can find that schedule on the Clinton County Reads Facebook page. So thanks again to you, Beth and Mark, and thanks to everyone for attending.
Thanks for having us.
inviting me.
Good night.
Take care, Beth.
Bye-bye.